chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Space. Written by Tom Farr. Performed by Jesse Cornett. And all the insects ceased in honor of the moon. Jack Kerouac, Lonesome Traveler. The trajectory's too high, too wide. Everything's gone wrong, and then some. Kazakov shouts at the mission console and gesticulates manically, as though command can actually see him. They fired the retro rockets and successfully re-entered Earth's atmosphere, but the superheated air and hot atmospheric gases have destroyed the internal wing structure, and now everything else is coming apart. There's auxiliary data and thermal stresses and compressed atmospheric gases, but Dyatlov knows that that's not what's going to kill them. The empty vault of cosmic waste wasn't so empty after all. It's the thing outside, riding the temporal winds of space and trailing phosphorescence like the trail of a comet that's going to eliminate their map. The deep vacuum of intergalactic space renders the keening shrieks and anemic hisses silent, but he can still hear them echoing off the walls of his skull. He shudders at the thought of whatever dark abyssal womb could have birthed such an eldritch horror as the thing that's tearing at the mid-fuselage and clawing at the side hatch. There's a sickly flash of bluish purple at the overhead windows, and even though he can't hear them, he can feel the dozens of sharp, chitinous limbs tap, tap, tapping on the roof. Something bumps against the side of his head. It's Kazakov's graduation photo, and the kid looks even younger than he does now, except that in the photograph, Kazakov's hair is cropped, and there isn't a hint of a beard in sight. Beyond the curved windows of the crew compartment, all of the Earth is a toy. A lonely globe, half-shaded in a library window. All land and water and light and dark and more untraveled places than Dyatlov has hairs on his head. A terrible vibration shudders through everything, and he imagines the ablative heat shielding being peeled away, like the lid of a can of sardines. Gaining speed now, losing altitude. Never a good combination. That not-so-distant Earth stares unblinkingly, a cosmic eye of cyclopean proportions. Dyatlov wonders how the Vedernikov looks, plummeting through the cosmic vastness, leaving a twisted tail of shed debris in its wake. Then he thinks about what it is that's tearing the shuttle apart. He glimpses something at the starboard window that's broad and flat and segmented and could be a head, except there's no eyes and no mouth and no antenna. Just rigid arrangements of jagged mandibles, glistening the color of rotten teeth. Then it's gone, and the 1.3-inch thick optical pane of fused aluminum silica glass is spider-webbed with cracks. Kazakov has abandoned the mission console and is struggling into his extravehicular mobility unit spacesuit. It incorporates a built-in life support system in the backpack which won't save him from burning up or being torn apart. They won't make it. But there's another way, a quicker way. Dyatlov unfolds the stock of the triple-barreled survival gun, the same model that's been on board every Soviet spacecraft in history. It's loaded with rifle bullets. Dyatlov calls to Kazakov, and when the younger man turns with one leg still hanging out of his spacesuit, he shoots him in the forehead. Dyatlov's teeth clack off the gun's cold metal barrel as he jams it against the roof of his mouth. He wraps his left hand around the stock and one finger of his right hand around the trigger. He can taste gun oil dripping behind his tongue. It's the only way. His eyes find the thing looming in the starboard window. Its segmented coils glisten the bluish gray of a man's intestines. He was wrong. There is a mouth. Dyatlov's finger squeezes the trigger at the exact moment two huge segmented forcipules tear through the Vedernikov, and the ravenous dark rushes inside. The water was black and choppy and slapped and sloshed against the side of the tiny wooden rowboat. The boy gripped the slippery wood as the old man bent his crooked spine to the oars. The last flickering of the waning sunset skirted a troubled sky. Dark panes of glass glinted along the shoreline, painted boards warped and weathered and bathed in dusky gray half-light. The boy trailed his hand in the rowboat's chilly wake, but didn't leave the hand in the black water for all too long. He gazed up at the large pale moon and wondered why it was so empty, then down at the other moon rippling and floating on the water. The boy blinked, took a sharp breath of raw and blistering air. He leaned over and tugged at one of the old man's sleeves. The boy pointed to the spot below the surface where they'd seen the leggy snake. The old man unhooked the lantern from its pole and shone it where the boy was pointing. The water there gaped black and empty, like an open grave. Quickly, the boy explained what it was that he'd seen. The old man's pinched face tightened, his eyes glimmering dully in their nests of wrinkles. He said, and hooked the lantern back on its pole and returned to the oars. Don't tell your grandmother. The boy shivered. He knew that the shiny metal in the lake helped to put food on the table, and he was grateful to God for sending it. But he hated coming out here so close to full dark. He thought that the old man did too, because now he was rowing faster. The boy kept his hands out of the water until he helped the old man drag the boat up onto the stony beach. The lake was thick with gathering dusk. Blackness so deep it hurt the boy's eyes. He wound in the excess rope and fed the looped end through the center eye of the cleat at the rear of the boat. He turned for a final sight of the far shore, such as he could make out. And that was when he heard the soft splashing. No, not splashing. More like thrashing. And it was coming closer. The boy knew that there were seals in the lake because he'd seen them for himself, and the old man had told him that they were being hunted whenever they came on shore. But this didn't sound like a seal. The boy stared at the impossibly dark space between the shores, and the splashing that wasn't quite splashing continued. It was, he realized, the sound of a body slipping into the water, or slipping out of it. A lot of bodies, too. Or one very long one. A leggy one. When the stones off to his right began to skitter and tinkle and whisper over one another, the boy's whole body went cold, and then he was off up the shore at a dead run, away from whatever was moving by the water, away from the splashing and the scuttling and the stealthy tap-tap-tapping of what sounded like hundreds of tiny hammers chipping away at the dark. 1/5 of all the fresh water on the surface of the world. Hal lighted another cigarette. No way. No way. Truth. 5,500 cubic miles of unfrozen fresh water. Big rivers and small rivers and streams and estuaries and tributaries and glaciated headwater. More than 300 finish up right here. Brandy looked out across the wind-roiled water, an endless black abyss, rising and falling and swelling as though it were the maw of some great beast, chewing and just about ready to spit something out. The sheer pressure of the water contained within the colossal structural hollow formed by the surrounding mountains was, in itself, almost utterly overwhelming. Oldest freshwater lake on Earth, Hal continued, casting his gaze over the water. Deepest, too. But don't ask me how deep, because I don't know. Maybe nobody knows. Subaqueous in the extreme. Exactly. The old woman wrung her weathered hands in her lap, the wrinkles eroding the sun-darkened skin on her face, and cheeks deepened when she coughed. She spoke for a long time, and Anton translated. A long time ago, a boy lived by the lake. His name was Ityander. Anton frowned, puzzled. I think that's how it's pronounced in your English. Anyway, Ityander loved the lake and loved swimming in the water and diving down below the surface. But one day, a monster from the deepest deep reached out and touched Ityander. And the boy became very ill. Anton turned to the woman and snapped something in Russian. She shook her head, scratched at the swollen, lit red lumps on her wrists and the inflamed backs of her hands. Anton continued. To save the boy's life, his father instructed the hospital to replace young Ityander's lungs with the gills of a shark. But as the seasons withered and died, Ityander became less and less comfortable on land, until eventually he went to live in the lake. He watches over fishermen, because his father was one. It keeps them safe from storms and monsters and such. Brandy laughed and shook her head and said, Even in your folklore, the men are sexist jackasses. Hal laughed at that. And Anton bellowed like an ox, and the old woman cackled right along with them. Hal thanked her, and Brandy thanked her, and then Anton shooed her away inside, and they advanced down the old porch's creaky wooden steps. Brandy stopped and turned her gaze up as the three of them made their way down the rutted, unpaved road. Like a grubby pane of glass, the sky was gray, and so were the rain clouds. She snuggled deeper into her yellow and orange ski parka and hurried to catch up to where Hal and Anton were leaving the road. They approached an old and dilapidated one-story building, yellow-colored, wood-stained with blotches of reddish-brown, all warped angular plank and corroded shingle. Wooden crates stacked against a slouching porch, everything speckled with parasitic fungal patches, the color of half-picked scabs, and maculated by slime-green lake scum. At the rear of the building, a crumbling brick dependency that could once have been an outhouse or a tool shed. They advanced upon the porch. Brandy fumbled the first couple of steps, slick and skewed as they were. The mildewed wood sighed and creaked. The air in the porch was thick, fusty and foul and fly-blown as an old dead dog bloating in a waterlogged basement. There was no door, only a rectangle of blackness yawning like a lidless coffin. Hal fiddled with the camera. Anton was muttering in Russian and worrying at a vile heap of filthy rags piled in one corner. There were more crates on the porch, primary-colored plastic, old and faded. stacked 2 and 3 high, and each crate holding 6 glass canning jars, 2 rows of 3. The jars were the type with squat, round bodies and screw-top lids, and looked surprisingly clean, incongruent with the otherwise abominable filth. What looked to be strands of kelp or weed bellowed in the tea-colored water that filled each jar to the brim. Curious, Brandy reached out one hand towards the closest crate.
Nie prikasiec, kenjemio.
The voice was wet and phlegmy, the accent heavy. In the corner of the porch, the heap of rags stirred, and a face the color of curdled milk made itself known amongst the vile swaddling. Hal and Anton were both staring at her. Hal looked worried. Anton, amused. Had she screamed? The man in rags suddenly doubled over, racked by a rattling fit of coughing. Wet, ragged, like water on the lung. Anton made the introductions while Hal poked all about the porch, and Brandy fumbled a notepad from her rucksack. The biro pen tucked in the black spiral binding wouldn't write, and the next one was red. She hated writing in red, so she put the pen and the notebook back in her bag and took out her digital voice recorder.
Ready.
Want me to record too?
No, it's okay.
Okay. When they were finished, Anton wheeled the old man inside. The chair's wheels looked as though they had come from a dog cart, and the spokes were rusted, and the whole thing creaked and groaned as it rolled over the threshold. Brandy and Hal exchanged uneasy glances and turned to regard the crates and the jars.
I didn't notice the legs before,
Brandy whispered. Hal had gone to watch the sun fall from the sky. Anton was eating. Brandy had taken the opportunity to transcribe the interview with the man in the wheelchair. Headphones in, she burrowed into her hispar combi-down, with her notepad resting on her thighs, and a biro in her hand, a blue one.
The first time was when he was young, out fishing on the lake with his grandpapa. He says it was swimming in the moon and that it was longer than a mountain. It moved like a snake, but it had 1,000 legs. It came from the sky. God sent it to earth in a pillar of fire, like a spear from heaven. He won't tell me what that means. He saw it next that summer, swimming in the lake. Smooth bluish gray coils, the color of ice under a cloudy sky. He says that's when he first realized that there was more than one, because the coils were too far apart. But he hasn't seen any of them swimming for years. They crawl on the bottom of the lake now. That's what he thinks. They crawl in the deepest deep. And that's why he catches the little ones. Because he knows what happens when they get big.
The lake lay sullen and secular as a stained glass window painted black. The sun had almost completely slipped behind the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, and only faint splinters of light remained. Scoters and gulls, and maybe even a sea eagle, flitted through the shadows, tiny black V-shapes spiraling in flashes of sunset. In the gathering gloom on the distant shore, a glint of gold, a blade of polished sunlight. Hal blinked, and when he looked again, nothing was visible there, save for the ever-deepening dusk. Brandy was putting her notepad away in her rucksack when Hal pulled back the tent flap and ducked through the low opening. One boot on and one boot off. He took off the other boot and left both boots under the small awning at the front of the tent, then zipped the flap back up and crawled into his Hispar 500 down. His sleeping bag was burnt orange. Brandy's was blue. They sat in silence for a few minutes, allowing the cold that had followed Hal inside to dissipate. Their breath fogged in the air. Eventually, Brandy said,
"Where's Anton?"
"Drinking."
"There's a surprise."
"He's a good guy, Brand. He's also Russian." She giggled a little at that.
Did you find a boat in the end?"
I found something wooden with oars that aren't too badly cracked. It'll do."
"Okay."
What do you think the pillar of fire was, Brand?"
"Not a spear from heaven."
No, I guess not.
"You can see the aurora borealis here in the spring and autumn equinoxes."
But you don't think that's what it was?
"No, I don't. I don't think it's what any of them were."
Brandy unzipped her rucksack and took out a black leather notebook hiding amidst her battalion of notepads. She tossed it to Hal. His gloved hands proved barely dexterous enough to catch it. Tucked between the pages, yellowed and not-so-yellowed newspaper clippings, and torn-out pages from books, and handwritten notes on yellow legal pad paper. From the Siberian Times, 30th of March, 1983. Aliens underwater at world's deepest lake. Military divers encounter extraterrestrial swimmers at depth of 50 meters. They had too many limbs to be human, one source claims. From the Moscow Times, 27th of October 1974. Body of dead alien found in Buryation Lake. Experts discount possibility of a hoax. This is the real thing, former KGB scientist declares. From the London Times, 14th of April 1963. UFOs seen again at Angara River. Witness describes huge spider-like craft, says, "My God, it was terrifying." From the Scottish Herald, 10th of October 1989. 50-foot monster sighted in Russian lake. Rare sighting sends tourists fleeing in terror. From the Wall Street Journal, 27th of July 1998. Cold War diary describes huge UFO crash in 1953. Scientists baffled as to possible identity of enormous ring craft of tremendous size. From the Athens Messenger, 13th of October 2004. Giant chilopoda could inhabit other planets. Entomologist denounces ideas of little green men. Declares the square cube law flawed. Evolutionary pressure will force gigantic arthropod growth, she declares. Hal flicked through the rest of the notebook, stopping at pages to which photographs had been taped. A grainy black and white enlarged photo of a disc-shaped object against a hazy patch of sky. A glossy and inexpensive-looking color Polaroid of what could be a terribly thin chimpanzee loping between trees. A pinkish smudge of hand framing a sleek gray shape blurring across a roiling body of water. A claustrophobically pitch-black Polaroid with a flashlit foreground. In one corner of the box-like space, a pale, chalky yellow face with strange pebbled skin and huge, expressionless, almond-shaped eyes, black as the Polaroid's background. This last image unnerved Hal more than he cared to admit. The vague rumor of a night-blackened window and a landscape of bedroom furniture in the background conjured, well, extremely unpleasant notions of where the photograph had been taken, and he closed the notebook and tossed it back to Brandy. "So you're really into all this, huh?" And here was me thinking this was all just a good excuse to blow scholarship money and explore the frozen tundra with the UK's most handsome indie filmmaker. Brandy shook her head.
There's something out there, Hal. I just know there is.
The truth is out there, Scully.
You're hilarious. I'm going to sleep. You should too. You've got a lot of rowing to do tomorrow. Good night.
Rowing. Brilliant. Something woke Hal in the early hours. A noise? He held his breath until he could hear the blood squeaking through his head. But the night held its breath too, and remained treacherously silent. Hal let out a soundless sigh and stared at the nylon wall, listening to the soft, even exhalations of Brandy's sleep. She seemed impossibly distant now in the pit-dark tent. He had almost drifted back off to sleep when he heard it, a faint scuffling somewhere beyond the tent flap. He froze, trapped his breath. Muffled sobs, stones crunching underfoot, splashing that didn't quite sound right, somehow. Then, silence. When Brandy woke the next morning, the membranous nylon roof of the tent was aglow with the weak light of dawn. Everything was cold, and the tent flap was half unzipped. Hal's boots were gone from beneath the awning, but she could hear his voice somewhere, almost out of earshot, like a radio left on in a distant room of a large and empty house. The glow of dawn had fled the sky, and rain clouds were rolling in above the distant mountains when she finally emerged from the tent. Tiny droplets of water pinpricked her exposed face and the backs of her hands. She pulled on her gloves as she walked down the rough strip of scrub to the stony shore, where Hal and Anton stood beside a narrow spine of rock that jutted out into the lake. The trailing end of her scarf snapped in the wind, and her hair billowed out behind her as a sudden gust of wind blasted across the flat surface of the lake. All in all, the weather seemed as nervous as she was.
Good Lord,
Brandy said when she reached the two men.
somebody had a rough night.
Anton was the pallor of a corpse, except for an angry red cyst-like swelling just below his left eye. He tried to speak, but was interrupted by a fit of violent coughing that caused his whole body to jerk and shudder.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Pardon me. He slumped back down and was promptly racked by further coughing before he could properly regain his breath. His breathing was sodden and ragged, as though each exhalation was being forced through a sheet of humectant tissue paper. Nearby, a wooden rowboat that looked about as seaworthy as a bucket perforated with holes was tethered to a pole driven into the shale. Hal was scowling furiously at the bobbling vessel, his features dark.
Anton,
Brandy said, turning to the Russian.
is this, well, safe?
Anton sharpened up and lifted his gaze. His eyes were alarmingly bloodshot.
It will do for two,
He said.
I will hike the western shore
He pointed to a distant stretch of shoreline.
and signal you when I arrive. There is something there you will need to see.
And what's that? Wondered Hal. Anton shook his head.
I will signal from western shore.
He repeated, kneading his eyes with the heels of his palms. The back of one hand was swollen and inflamed, Brandy noticed. She watched him get up and march away straight-backed along the stony shore, pausing only to stand doubled over with his hands on his knees, coughing uncontrollably. Hal had been scrutinizing the rowboat, but now he was staring somewhere over her left shoulder. She turned her head, following his line of sight to the squalid skyline of plank and shingle following the curve of the lake. A knot of ragged figures had gathered at the mouth of the rutted trail leading down to the shore. Hal raised a hand, but the figures remained motionless.
Well, good luck to you too, then, he murmured, turning back to the boat. He stretched his arms and sighed. Let's get on with this, shall we? The lake was like a mirror painted black. Brief reflections of sunlight were still obtainable, but were almost immediately occulted by the watery shadows. Vague shapes moved slowly beneath the ebon surface, amorphous apparitions that seemed to drift closer and closer to the boat until the rhythmic slap of an oar shattered the surface and sent them scurrying for the depths. Luciferian witches, Hal recalled reading once, used plates of glass painted black to communicate with spirits and shades and to encourage demonic possession. He glanced back at Brandy, who had removed one glove to trail her hand in the water. Oldest freshwater lake on Earth. Deepest, too. A true primordial abyss. He bent his back to the oars, half expecting at any moment for the water to bulge and swell, to disgorge some colossal cephalopodic creature with huge bulging eyes and great whipping tentacles. Some eldritch horror of a true Lovecraftian bent. So, it was understandable when something slapped wetly against his shoulder that Hal lurched forward and almost capsized the boat. Jumpy? Brandy grinned, drying her hands on her jeans. Look, over there. Hal choked his galloping heart back down into his chest and looked around. A flash of gold, like sunlight reflecting off a stream. There again, a spiderweb glint of light between a pair of pale dead trees. Hal veered the boat towards the flint-gray scimitar of shore, rowing until the transom grated on the stone. Careful! Brandy cried. Hal ignored her. When she got out, he dragged the boat right up onto the shore, as there was no decent tether. Anton wasn't there. The trees were like ghosts, twisted and gnarled, and dead and gray. Dry, clattering branches raking a troubled sky, shedding handfuls of fiery leaves. Anton! Anton! You there, mate? Nothing. Hal turned to Brandy, exasperated. I don't know, she said. I don't... There! Hal snapped his head around so quickly that pain lanced down his neck. He caught a flash of gold out of the corner of his eye. What's he playing at? Anton! I guess he wants us to go in there. Brandy's teeth worried at her bottom lip. I'm not sure about this, Hal. What if it's not Anton? Of course it's him, Hal snapped. Then, seeing the flash of hurt on Brandy's face, he said, Whatever happened to playing a hunch, Scully? She chuckled. Oh, God. I guess you're right. Of course I am. He's just trying it on. Hal shook his head, sighed. Bloody Russian sense of humor. Before they started out into the woods, Hal spared a final glance back over his shoulder at the rock-ribbed shoreline snaking away into the distance, at the blustery water slapping the stones. The far shore was shrouded in mist, the black water unending, a successory sheet of jagged motion. They were deep in the woods, Hal leading, Brandy following, before he started to notice things. Damaged tree trunks, deep gouges, and splintered wood. Huge, smooth troughs cut through the upheaved soil, flanked on either side by strange foot-wide diagonal marks in the ground. Things. The air was thick with a bitter almond-like scent, a smell like cherry laurel, a smell like cyanide. The stillness was solemn and soundless, the atmosphere of wrongness almost palpable. A flash of white caught his periphery,
concurrent with a barely audible rustling, like crumpled newspaper or someone climbing a ladder while wearing blue paper overalls. A sharp hiss, and then a muffled thud. Hal froze. "Bren?" Suddenly, he felt very, very cold. He didn't turn around, and there was no reply. "Anton?" Nothing. A slow, sodden step towards him. Another. Thud. 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 "It's RoboCop," he thought, and didn't know whether to laugh or scream or fall to his knees and sob, so instead, he simply turned around. Beams of weak sunlight blinked between the trees, glinting on the ocular curve of a thick gold-tinted visor. Standing less than 4 paces from him was a figure clad in a bulky white pressure suit, with convoluted rubber joints at its shoulders, elbows, wrists, hips, knees, and ankles. Silver rings at the wrists and neck, probably for attaching gloves and a helmet. The suit was torn and ripped and faded, and thick with dust and filth. Beyond the figure, Brandy lay motionless on the ground. Thud. Thud. The soil sucked at the pressure suit's clunky boots. Hal stared at himself in the golden blank of the astronaut's face. Thud. And that was when the great fallen tree straddling a nearby ditch began to move. A huge dorso-ventrally flattened trunk raised itself from the ground. Smooth, segmented plates of chitin, the bluish-gray of frost-bitten flesh, suspended in a cradle of long, sharp limbs. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Legs creaking. The endless, segmented monstrosity turned and lifted its broad, flat head, clacking its huge forcipules with a sound like sledgehammers striking concrete. Giant chilopoda. Evolutionary pressure. Thud. The helmet's smooth golden curvature filled Hal's vision. His body was stone, his legs taken root in the soil. The smell of almonds and cherries and sickly sweet death choked his lungs. His breath fogged the visor's surface. Then, the astronaut raised the visor, and Hal was screaming. Unable to move even his little finger, but screaming so loudly he could feel the muscles in his throat tearing. Revealed in the claustrophobic space within the hard plastic helmet, a writhing bolus of centipedes. Thousands of rigid sub-cylindrical shapes moving lazily, burrowing amongst one another, hinged bodies dry and creaking and twisting in the dusty light. Hal wheeled himself backwards, but before his body could even contemplate motion, the decaying palm of a molded, rubberized glove had closed about his jaw. The astronaut that was no longer an astronaut leaned in close. Desiccated skin clung like tattered rags to the vague suggestion of a skull long since hollowed out by 1,000 burrowing centipedes. The gloved hand used its thumb and forefinger to force Hal's jaw open wide like a dog taking a pill. Only he wasn't a dog, and the sinuous form detaching itself from the sluggish mass of chilopoda and slithering into his gaping mouth was not a pill. Crawling. He could feel it crawling down his throat, feel his throat bulge with the centipede's chitinous rigidity. Razor-sharp legs pinpricked the roof of his mouth as the chilopoda burrowed up into the fleshy softness there. Agony. Indescribable agony. The world blurred, sheeted in red. The invertebrate's forcipules flailed somewhere behind his eyes as it burrowed up into his skull. The chilopoda uncoiled its body, and he howled and vomited and shook as those cruel, barbed legs began to scrape at the bone of his skull. Brandy stares out of the plane's small window at the bleak gray landscape, flecked with dark bodies of water and studded with flinty gray crops of mountains. She sighs, involuntarily touches her bandaged head, the swelling around her eye socket. She's lucky that the 3 seal hunters found her when they did. There's no telling what Hal and Anton would have done otherwise. The sick sensation of betrayal runs bone deep and hurts more than anything. Suddenly, the scent of almonds filling her nostrils. Her stomach convulses, lurching wildly. She fumbles her seatbelt undone, apologizes to her vaguely irritated neighbor as she hurries to the box-like restroom. She locks the doors, falls to her knees, and vomits into the lidless toilet. She stands up and flushes the toilet and looks at herself in the mirror. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, inspecting her cuts and bruises and bandages. Her jaw aches like the devil himself, and the roof of her mouth is sore and tender, inflamed like the backs of her hands. Slowly, gently, she eases her mouth open, wider and wider. Her jaw muscles creak like old leather. She tilts her head backwards until she can see her uvula in the mirror. For a split second, the light gleams on something smooth and shiny. Something the sickly yellow of rotten teeth. The dun bluish gray of a clouded winter sky.
Chilling tales for dark nights.